There are now 2 minutes equally divided prior to the Rosenberg nomination.
Madam President.
The senator from Florida.
Madam President.
The Senate will be in order.
Just to remind the Senate that Senator Rubio and I have the nonpartisan process of a judicial nominating commission for our federal district judges, and Robin Rosenberg is a product of that, and so I commend to the Senate this bipartisan nominee from the two of us.
Is there further debate on the nomination? Without objection, all time is yielded back. The question is on the Rosenberg nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Brasso. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Walsh, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Barrasso, Begich, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Corker, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Flake, Franken, Graham, Hagan, Heinrich, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kane, King, Kirk, Landrieu, Lee, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Hall, Portman, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Roberts, Sanders, Schatz, Scott, Shaheen, Shelby, Stabnow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. Walsh. Mr. Walsh. Aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley. Aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates. Aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch. Aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer. Aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn. Aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Pryor. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. Aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin. Aye. Mr. Harkin, Mr. Harkin. Aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Aye. Ms. Hirono, Ms. Hirono. Aye. Ms. Mikulski. Aye.
Does any senator wish to change his or her vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 100, the nays are 0, and the nomination is confirmed.